Just hours ago, King Charles stunned the nation personally, reversing a controversial decision made by Queen Camilla regarding one of her most high-profile charities. But what forced this sudden U-turn? And why did it follow a private, emotionally charged plea from Prince William himself? This wasn't just about charity, this was about legacy, power, and something far deeper. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The news broke with no warning. An official palace statement, brief but explosive, confirmed that King Charles had intervened, overriding Queen Camilla's earlier announcement to dissolve a beloved children's charity. It wasn't just the decision that rattled the public, it was the fact that Charles, known for his caution and loyalty to protocol, had overruled his own queen. In a monarchy defined by control and quiet coordination, this was a rupture. Camilla's earlier move, one that would have cut ties with long-standing beneficiaries, was defended by her team as a modernizing effort, a polite way to sideline what many saw as outdated obligations. But among those outdated causes was a legacy that ran much deeper than paperwork. It was a cause once cherished by Princess Diana herself, and now, with the king reversing that decision, questions exploded across the media. What had changed? Why now? And most importantly, who had the power to make Charles turn back? Behind the scenes, whispers had already begun. Staffers noted the urgency with which the king called for the reversal, ignoring traditional advisory channels, bypassing Camilla's private secretaries, and issuing the correction personally through his own team. For those who understood the rhythms of the palace, this was not normal. It was emotional, and it pointed to a confrontation that had likely already occurred, one the public would never see, but the consequences of which were now playing out in full view of the world. Palace sources spoke of a tense atmosphere in Clarence House, of hushed conversations behind locked doors, and a king who appeared unusually withdrawn in the hours leading up to the announcement. And then, a single detail emerged, unconfirmed but quietly passed between correspondents. Prince William had visited the king. Not through aides, not on a scheduled appearance, but directly, privately. The timing of that visit matched the moment everything began to change. Suddenly, all eyes turned to the heir. Was it William who had forced the reversal? Was it William who had finally crossed the invisible line to challenge not just Camilla's authority but his father's silence? If true, it would mark a seismic shift inside the monarchy. Until now, William had remained guarded, a steady future king refusing to engage in old wars. But now, he had intervened. And not just over a policy decision, this was about something sacred, something personal. His involvement shattered assumptions within the palace about loyalty, submission, and power. Because when a son confronts a father who also wears a crown, it's never just a conversation, it's a reckoning. But to understand why William risked everything to intervene, we must look at the origins of this decision and the quiet power Camilla had been building beneath the crown. Behind the smiles and ceremonies, Queen Camilla had been consolidating control softly, subtly, but decisively. Her influence over Charles's decisions had grown stronger with each passing year. But when she moved to restructure one of the monarchy's oldest charitable arms, something ancient stirred beneath the surface. What seemed like a harmless administrative adjustment was, in truth, the latest step in a quiet shift of power, one that had gone unnoticed by the public, but was felt deeply within the palace walls. Camilla had risen from outsider to queen consort with remarkable speed, and now she wielded that authority with a confidence that unsettled even those who once supported her ascent. After the coronation, her hold over royal charities became unmistakable. She began selecting advisors, redirecting funding, and merging causes she believed no longer fit the monarchy's modern image. Her vision was clear, calculated, and unapologetic. What she called necessary evolution felt to many insiders like a purge. Programs tied to decades of royal tradition now stood on the edge of dissolution, and among those traditions were organizations still carrying Diana's unmistakable imprint. Camilla's restructuring included the controversial merging of several long-standing charitable bodies into a sleek, elite-focused foundation. It aimed to attract high-profile donors, corporate alliances, and global visibility, but in doing so, it risked erasing the heart of the causes that once defined the monarchy's compassion. Staff members who tried to express concern quickly realized the direction had already been chosen. Camilla was surrounding herself with modern strategists' figures, known not for royal loyalty, but for influence, connections, and ambition. These advisors pushed for a future where the monarchy operated like a global brand, not a family bound by service. With every change, royal traditionalists grew increasingly uneasy, sensing that something fundamental was being lost. And while Charles publicly supported his queen, those closest to the situation knew his approach had become passive, shaped more by emotional dependence than strategic leadership. In private whispers, aides wondered whether he still commanded the institution or whether his decisions were slowly being guided by someone else. Critics outside the palace were far less subtle. They accused Camilla of intentionally phasing out Diana's legacy, replacing it with her own narrative of modern royalty. Commentators pointed out that the very charities Diana had poured her soul into were the ones facing the harshest restructuring, fueling an old rivalry the palace had worked so hard to bury. The headlines grew sharper. Is Camilla rewriting royal history? Why Diana's causes are suddenly at risk? And yet, through all the noise, one figure remained notably silent: Prince William. His silence wasn't indifference, it was restraint. The public saw a calm heir who refused to be dragged into the battles of the past. But inside the palace, people sensed something heavier in him. A quiet storm building with each announcement, each restructuring, each blow to the memory of the woman who shaped his heart and his values. Those who worked most closely with William noticed subtle shifts: long pauses during meetings, late-night calls to staff, sudden visits to charities now facing uncertainty. Still, he said nothing. He chose diplomacy over confrontation, even as the shadow of his mother's legacy grew thinner under Camilla's expanding influence. But beneath that calm exterior lay a pain that had never truly healed, a grief that Camilla's decisions were now reopening with force. Because for William, this wasn't an administrative shift or a political disagreement, it was an emotional rupture. Every charity at risk felt like another piece of Diana disappearing. Every press headline comparing Camilla's authority to his mother's compassion felt like another battle he never wanted to fight. And while he maintained a steady exterior before the world, the weight inside him was reaching its breaking point. His silence wasn't acceptance, it was preparation. The moment was coming when he would no longer hold back, but the silence was deceptive. In truth, William had been watching, waiting, and grieving, because this wasn't just a decision about charities, it was personal, deeply personal. She's been gone for decades, but Princess Diana's presence still haunts every corridor of the royal institution. And when Camilla moved to dissolve a children's hospice once opened by Diana herself, it wasn't just a policy decision, it was an erasure. For William, it was a wound reopened. The news came quietly at first, a line buried in a restructuring report, a sterile phrase about consolidation and redirection. But to those who knew the history, it wasn't quiet at all. The hospice wasn't just another royal commitment, it was a cornerstone of Diana's compassion. She had walked its halls, comforted its patients, and poured herself into its cause during the height of public scrutiny. To see it now quietly slated for termination, reduced to a financial footnote in Camilla's strategy, wasn't just a practical choice. It was an emotional strike to the very core of Diana's enduring legacy. Within hours, the public reacted. Loyalists, charities, and Diana's longtime supporters took to the press, to social media, to the streets. This wasn't efficiency, it was erasure. Headlines raged. Diana's work dismantled by Camilla's palace. The narrative that the royal family had tried so hard to control for decades had burst open again. And behind the palace walls, William was unraveling. According to close aides, the moment he saw the restructuring documents, he fell into stunned silence. He didn't speak. He simply walked. Alone, through the same Kensington corridor his mother used to walk every evening when she returned from hospital visits, often in tears. One staffer said it was like watching a ghost retrace another's footsteps. William had held his grief tightly for years, never allowing it to interfere with duty. But this wasn't politics, it was personal. Deeply personal. He had made a silent promise the day she died to keep her legacy alive no matter what. And now that promise was being tested, not by a political enemy or the press, but from within his own family. There were reports of an emotional breakdown behind closed doors. William, the composed future king, seen crumpling into a chair, head in hands, voice shaking with fury and grief. He spoke of memories that hadn't left him since childhood. His mother's laughter in hospital wards, the warmth she brought to dying children, the look in her eyes when she said, "They just want to be seen." And now, the woman who had once stood in Diana's shadow was rewriting that story with a red pen. The emotional burden was unbearable. William wasn't just trapped between tradition and modernity. He was trapped between two queens, one who gave him life and shaped his values, and one who now shaped the institution he would one day lead. And the truth cut deeper than he admitted even to himself. Camilla wasn't simply changing the monarchy. She was redefining the very essence of what royal service meant, and in doing so, she was slowly pushing Diana's memory to the edge. But William hadn't yet spoken. The world didn't know what he was planning. Not even his closest advisors did. He had stayed composed during past controversies. He had endured the silence, the comparisons, the burdens of succession. But this wasn't something he could walk past. It was a line. And it had been crossed. Fueled by grief and duty, William makes a move that would change the royal calculus. He requests a private audience with his father, one-on-one, away from Camilla. No cameras, no advisors. Just a father and son behind closed doors, two future kings, divided by loyalty, love, and loss. What happened inside that room shocked even those closest to the crown. Because William didn't just plead, he cried. The meeting had been arranged quietly, outside the normal rhythm of palace protocol. William didn't bring aides, he didn't ask permission. He simply called his father and said they needed to speak alone. Balmoral, the most isolated of the royal residences, became the stage for what would later be described as a conversation that cracked the monarchy in two. Those who were nearby said the king was subdued before William arrived, already sensing the weight of what was coming. What followed wasn't a policy discussion. It wasn't negotiation. It was something far more raw. William began not with anger, but with memory. He spoke not as the heir to the throne, but as Diana's son. He described in painful detail the last charity event he attended with his mother, how she knelt beside a terminally ill child, how she whispered hope into a place filled with sorrow, how she turned pain into dignity. His voice trembled as he spoke, but it didn't break until he asked the question that neither of them had ever truly faced. "Do you still remember her promise?" he asked his father, his voice barely audible. The room reportedly fell into a stillness so deep it felt like time had paused. Because the promise he spoke of wasn't a public vow, it was private. A promise Diana had made to William as a child, that he would never be used, never be silenced, never be forced to choose between truth and tradition. And now, Camilla's decision to dismantle one of Diana's final charitable legacies had brought that promise back with the force of a thunderclap. Charles, the monarch known for poise and control, sat speechless. Those close to him would later say his eyes filled with something rare regret, not just for the moment, but for years of emotional distance, missteps, and choices he could never undo. William didn't lecture, he didn't demand. But his pain filled the space like a tidal wave. For the first time in his adult life, he laid bare the fracture in their relationship, the invisible wound that had shaped every royal duty, every public smile, every private silence. He reminded his father of who Diana was, not the media icon, but the mother who fought for the voiceless, who built a legacy out of human connection, not political convenience. And then, in a tone both firm and heartbreakingly vulnerable, he delivered the line that no heir had ever dared say to a reigning monarch. "I will not support this decision." It wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. One drawn, not in anger, but in sorrow. And in that instant, something fundamental shifted in Charles. Not because William had outmaneuvered him politically, but because the boy who had once walked behind his mother's coffin now stood before him as a man who would not betray her memory. And in that moment, something shifted inside King Charles. But to understand why this moment shattered him, we need to step back into the very beginning of their fractured royal journey. They were never truly close. From the moment Diana's coffin was followed by two broken boys, the emotional distance between Charles and William only widened. And now, decades later, that silent chasm threatened to split the monarchy again. William had grown up in a palace of mirrors where appearances mattered more than emotions, where protocol suffocated vulnerability, and where love, when given, was often measured and quiet. With Diana, things were different. Her love had been loud, fierce, unfiltered. She held him tightly when he cried, listened when he spoke, and protected him from the crushing weight of royal life with every ounce of her soul. But with Charles, love was something to be assumed, not expressed. Their interactions were brief, scripted, transactional, and when Diana died, whatever emotional bridge had existed between father and son was swept away in the silence of that procession through London. The world watched two boys walk behind their mother's coffin. What the world didn't see was how far apart they felt, even as they stood side by side. Over the years, that gap never fully closed. Charles had tried, in his own way, inviting William into state matters, sharing in royal duties, and presenting a united front. But the damage had already been done. William couldn't forget the pain his mother endured, nor the man who, willingly or not, had allowed it to happen. The fallout of the divorce had painted Charles as cold, distracted, and distant. And when Camilla emerged from the shadows and was slowly welcomed into the royal fold, William didn't see a new beginning. He saw a betrayal, wrapped in ceremony. Camilla wasn't just his father's second chance. She was the woman his mother cried about behind closed doors. She was, in William's eyes, the uninvited queen. The years that followed were littered with uneasy moments. Speeches carefully worded to avoid stoking old wounds. Appearances choreographed to prevent awkward distance. Even William's wedding carried traces of quiet defiance. While Charles played his role with grace, there were whispers of tension behind the scenes, disagreements about guest lists, speeches, seating arrangements. It wasn't overt war, but it wasn't peace either. And as Camilla's position solidified and her public image softened, William remained cordial but cool. Behind the polished exterior was a reservoir of grief that had calcified into something heavier: silent resentment. For Charles, the guilt had never truly left. Not for the marriage, not for Diana, not for the boys. But he had learned to compartmentalize, to manage his legacy rather than mourn his past. Camilla had brought him comfort, stability, a partner who understood the machinery of royalty. But even as he leaned on her, he knew the cost. Diana's name would always cast a longer shadow, and with every new wave of public affection for William and Harry, Charles was reminded that his sons were not just heirs, they were her sons first. The legacy he tried to rebuild was always fractured by the woman he couldn't protect and the son he never truly reached. So when William looked at him, tearful and resolute, Charles wasn't just hearing a plea, he was hearing a lifetime of unresolved pain, a culmination of decades of silence, distance, and regret. This was more than a disagreement over a charity. It was a reckoning between a father and a son, between a past that refused to stay buried and a future too fragile to risk. But Charles's change of heart wasn't just about his son's tears, it was about something more dangerous. Something Camilla had been hiding, a truth long buried beneath palace silence. Behind every royal smile lies a web of power, and Queen Camilla's web ran deeper than anyone imagined. From aristocratic allies to hidden donors, her control wasn't just ceremonial, it was strategic, and now it was threatened. For years, Camilla had been quietly assembling a network of influence, one not built on popularity or sentiment, but on leverage, loyalty, and quiet transactions. Her rise to queen consort was not only a personal triumph, but the culmination of a long game that spanned decades. Behind the scenes, she was no longer the woman who had once stood in Diana's shadow. She had become a political force with her own circle of influence, a private court within the palace walls. Unseen by the public, her inner circle was advising on everything from charitable restructuring to media narratives. It wasn't just about trimming inefficiencies, it was about redefining royal focus. Meetings were held not in staterooms, but in private drawing rooms and country estates, where wealthy allies and influential donors shaped the vision of a monarchy that leaned corporate, global, and elite. The goal was simple: strip away sentiment, rebrand tradition, and eliminate emotional entanglements, especially those still tied to Diana's name. And then came the email. Leaked from within Camilla's advisory team, it described the decision to dissolve Diana-associated charities as a matter of brand clarity. That phrase alone sent shockwaves across royal watchers and loyalists. Brand clarity, to remove a children's hospice opened by Diana. The optics were brutal. The backlash was instant. But for those in Camilla's camp, this was a necessary step. Her monarchy, as they envisioned it, had no room for ghosts, even beloved ones. Yet not everyone within the palace was aligned. Rumours swirled of increasing tension between Camilla and the Princess of Wales. Catherine, beloved by the public and fiercely loyal to Diana's legacy, reportedly expressed private discomfort with the direction things were heading. Though never confrontational, her quiet resistance only added to the growing fracture within the firm. And Charles? Those closest to him began to notice a shift. He was harder to reach, increasingly dependent on Camilla's schedule, and visibly surrounded by people she had appointed. Senior aides who had served under both Charles and Diana found themselves pushed aside. Their influence fading behind closed doors, they were no longer welcome in. The monarchy, once ruled by tradition and diplomacy, now resembled a court defined by allegiance and access. What had started as a question of charity had become a question of control. William, watching from the sidelines, saw the web forming. Every headline about Diana's causes being shelved, every advisor reshuffled under Camilla's influence, every whisper about Catherine being too soft for the new era, he took note. And as the king grew increasingly insulated, it became clear this wasn't just a rivalry between two royal women. It was a quiet war for the soul of the monarchy, one that placed legacy, emotion, and memory on one side, and strategy, branding, and control on the other. Camilla's power was no longer abstract. It was real, measured, and rapidly expanding. The palace had become a battleground, and King Charles was no longer a passive monarch. He was preparing to act in a way no one predicted. No monarch in recent memory had dared override their consort publicly. But Charles, shaken by William's emotional plea and haunted by his own failures, did the unthinkable. He broke with protocol and broke Camilla's authority. The announcement came without warning, without consultation, and without precedent. A stark, formal statement issued through the palace press office confirmed that the charity previously marked for closure would not only be spared, but reinstated with a renewed grant directly from the sovereign grant itself. There was no mention of Queen Camilla, no joint signatures, no carefully worded phrases to protect reputations, just a clear directive from the king. Those inside the palace were stunned, not because the decision itself was controversial, but because of how it was delivered silently, swiftly, and without Camilla's knowledge. She found out like the rest of the world did at a public engagement, standing before cameras, blindsided by a decision that undercut her leadership in the most visible way possible. It was more than a policy shift. It was a public fracture, the kind Buckingham Palace spent decades trying to avoid. Behind closed doors, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Senior members of Camilla's staff reportedly erupted into chaos. Internal emails described the mood as a meltdown, with several advisors threatening resignation and others demanding answers from Charles's personal office. But there were no answers, only silence. The king had made his decision and refused to walk it back. Camilla, long used to managing her image behind the scenes, now faced a different reality. Her authority had been openly dismissed, not by critics or tabloids, but by her own husband. And while the press scrambled to decode the meaning of it all, the public had already drawn their lines. The nation split into two camps. Team Diana hailed the decision as justice, a long overdue act of honor toward the late princess. Hashtags surged. Old clips of Diana's charity work went viral. People wept. People cheered. Meanwhile, Team Camilla insisted the move was regressive, a dangerous step backward into sentimentality and symbolism. Royal watchers debated the implications. Had Charles been manipulated by emotion, or was this his first real act of conscience as king? But beneath the noise, something far more profound had happened. For the first time since taking the throne, Charles chose memory over monarchy. He chose the legacy of the woman he lost over the ambitions of the woman he married. And in doing so, he rewrote the dynamics of power inside the palace. William, meanwhile, remained silent. He had no need to speak. His father had spoken for him, and the message was clear. There are moments in monarchy when duty must bow to truth, when hierarchy must yield to healing. But that kind of decision doesn't come without consequences, especially when it humiliates a queen. But what happens when a queen is publicly humiliated and a son rises in influence? The fallout wasn't over. It was only beginning. The monarchy thrives on stability, but now, behind palace gates, alliances are shifting. Camilla feels betrayed. William feels vindicated. And Charles? Caught in a storm of his own making, with no compass, but the ghost of a woman he could never forget. In the 72 hours that followed the king's explosive reversal, Queen Camilla vanished from public life. No official explanation, no rescheduled appearances, just silence. And in that silence, speculation exploded. Was she furious, ill, or had she finally lost her grip on the palace she had spent a lifetime fighting to enter? Sources close to the royal press corps described the mood as frantic containment. Behind the curtains, Camilla's staff scrambled to reclaim control of the narrative, but the damage had already been done. She had been publicly undermined. And worse, she had been outmaneuvered by the very legacy she once tried to outlive. Outside the palace walls, a different story unfolded. William's growing presence was no longer subtle, it was seismic. His composure, his silence, and the dignity with which he carried the aftermath of the reversal all reminded the nation of someone else. Headlines began to whisper what no one had dared to say for years. He's becoming his mother's son. Public sympathy surged. Support for his causes ballooned overnight. Even those previously indifferent to royal politics found themselves drawn to the image of a man who had turned grief into action. He didn't have to give interviews. He didn't need a press campaign. All he had to do was stand still, and the country leaned in. Alongside him, Catherine stood quietly radiant. Her grace under pressure became the emotional stabilizer the monarchy desperately needed. In the midst of the storm, she became the calm. With Camilla in retreat and Charles appearing increasingly isolated, the Princess of Wales embodied a future many Britons longed for, a return to empathy, poise, and purpose. The more William rose, the more Catherine's presence became indispensable. And, together, they cast a long, unspoken shadow, one that seemed to grow longer with each passing day. Inside the institution, the repercussions were severe. Long-serving staffers from Camilla's advisory network began to exit, some quietly dismissed, others resigning abruptly. Internal documents hinted at a full communications overhaul, suggesting the monarchy's inner machine was being recalibrated from the top down. Charles, ever the constitutional traditionalist, now found himself questioning the very people he had once relied upon. Meetings were delayed, agendas rewritten. Some of Camilla's closest allies were suddenly being excluded from high-level briefings. It was as if the king, for the first time, was drawing boundaries not as a husband, but as a monarch, and yet the toll was evident. Charles looked older, slower, more unsure. The weight of the crown had never rested comfortably on his head, and now, burdened by personal regret and institutional fracture, he appeared diminished. The heir, meanwhile, appeared ready, confident, poised. The contrast was impossible to ignore. An aging king surrounded by instability, and a rising sun commanding both public faith and emotional momentum. The walls of the monarchy were not collapsing, but they were shifting, realigning, quietly cracking under the pressure of legacy, loyalty, and time. And for the first time in decades, the world saw not just a royal family in conflict, but a throne trembling on its axis. And yet, amidst the chaos, one question remains unanswered, the one that haunts every crown, every throne. What price must be paid for peace? In the end, the crown doesn't protect, it demands. King Charles made his choice, but legacy is never built without cost. And as William steps deeper into the role of protector and heir, the monarchy stands at a terrifying crossroads, one decision away from rupture. The world watched as Prince William, once a reserved royal shadowed by grief, rose to the prostrated microphone at a gala hosted by one of Diana's surviving charities. There were no palace advisors flanking him. No notes, just William undaunted, sincere, and for the first time in a long while, visibly emotional. His voice didn't shake, but it carried the weight of everything he'd lived through. He didn't mention his mother by name, but he didn't need to. The audience already knew who he was speaking for. His tribute to those who lead with compassion instead of command was not just a speech, it was a declaration. And within hours, it echoed across the globe. Headlines lit up with praise. Journalists called it Diana's Legacy Reborn. Social media turned the clip viral. In that moment, the heir was no longer just waiting, he was leading. But as William's star ascended, Camilla's presence began to recede. Quietly, strategically. She cancelled an appearance, then two. Then a scheduled meeting with one of the very foundations she'd been promoting months earlier. The palace offered no explanations, only polite deflections. But the speculation didn't need fuel. It had already caught fire. People began to ask, had the Queen been sidelined, or was she retreating from a war she no longer wished to fight? Whatever the reason, her absence was deafening, and her silence only amplified the suspicion that things behind the curtain were unraveling faster than anyone imagined. King Charles, too, seemed to buckle under the pressure. For the first time since his coronation, he appeared in public not with poise, but with something far rarer: vulnerability. Observers noticed it in his eyes, the hesitations in his words, the distant pauses in rehearsed ceremonies. It was clear he had been moved by William's confrontation, and even more so by the tide of public emotion that had followed. Behind the scenes, internal discussions began to shift. Long-standing advisors were being repositioned. Conversations about the future no longer danced around. Succession. They embraced it. Senior officials quietly initiated preparations for what they termed heir ascendancy. A slow but deliberate movement to ensure William's influence would not just grow, it would be protected. But that raised deeper, darker questions. Where did this leave Camilla? Once central to Charles's stability, her role was now unclear. Some insiders speculated that she was being eased into ceremonial obscurity. Others believed a more discreet arrangement had been brokered behind palace doors, one that allowed her dignity, but not control. No one could say for certain, but everyone could feel it. The balance had shifted. William's shadow now stretched across every corridor of the crown's future, and at the heart of it all, unspoken but undeniable, was the presence of a woman no longer alive, yet more powerful than ever. Diana's legacy, once buried beneath the weight of history and scandal, had risen again, not as a ghost but as a compass. Her values were no longer inconvenient, they were essential. And in honouring them, William had unknowingly redefined what it meant to be royal in the modern age. And so, the past refuses to rest. The future refuses to wait. And the crown, forever heavy, hangs between love, duty, and the ghosts who still whisper within the palace walls. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.